Good evening. I still miss getting to be with you guys for Bible study. It is by no means the same. There is so much blessing and so many good things that come about whenever you gather together with other Christians to study with them. That just doesn't happen the same way in this format. But I appreciate everyone's desire to continue to do the best that we can with the circumstances that we currently have. I appreciate you studying with me. I hope that we can have some back and forth from time to time with these topics and with this conversation. If you will, open your Bible to Psalm 39. Psalm 39 will be the first place we look tonight. We're going to kind of follow a similar format that we looked at last week, and that is picking out just 4 psalms, and we're going to kind of work through them, I would say somewhat systematically, but not entirely systematically. There's no real theme that's going to run through these 4 psalms. I think some of these are going to be well known, and some of them are going to be a little less well known. So for the ones that are less well known, I hope that they're an introduction to you to some of the beauty that is in the psalms. For the one that is well known, I hope that it is encouraging nonetheless. I want to spend our first couple minutes here in Psalm 39, and I just want to go ahead and start with reading the entire psalm together. Psalm 39, starting there right above verse 1. To the choir master, a psalm of David. I said, I will guard my ways, that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth with a muzzle, so long as the wicked are in my presence. I was mute and silent. I held my peace to no avail. My distress grew worse. My heart became hot within me. As I mused, a fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue. O Lord, make me know my end, and what is the measure of my days. Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days a few handbreadths, and a lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. Surely a man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing they are in turmoil. Man heaps up wealth and does not know who will gather. And now, O Lord, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. Deliver me from all my transgressions. Do not make me the scorn of the fool. I am mute. I did not open my mouth, for it is you who have done it. Remove your stroke from me. I am spent by the hostility of your hand. When you discipline a man with rebukes for sin, you consume like a moth what is dear to him. Surely all mankind is a mere breath. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Hold not your peace at my tears. For I am a sojourner with you, a guest like all my fathers. Look away from me that I may again smile before I depart and am no more. Psalm 39 is not the most straightforward of psalms. I think it's one of those psalms that as you begin, you have one idea of what the psalmist is going to be talking about. And as you move down through the psalm, it seems to maybe shift topics halfway through, and then it shifts topics yet again, seemingly. I think this is one of those psalms that there is just so much that is good inside the psalm that is sometimes hard for us to suss out. And I hope that by spending a few moments tonight together looking at Psalm 39, we might walk away with a better understanding of it and a better understanding of our relationship with God. We had looked last week at different psalms that had talked about the idea of keeping our mouth silent or watching over our lips and setting a guard over them. And it appears that as you read Psalm 39, verses 1 through about verse 2, it appears that we're going to start off with that same theme. So he mentions, I said I will guard my ways, that I may not sin with my tongue. That seems straightforward. He says, I will guard my mouth with a muzzle. And then there's this odd phrase at the end of verse 1. so long as the wicked are in my presence. He then continues a little further on into verse 2. I was mute and I was silent. I held my peace. And then again in verse 2, there's something odd. He did this to no avail, and my distress grew worse. So whatever is going on here in verse 1 and verse 2, I think we have to conclude that this is not the same silence that David speaks of in other Psalms, where he's going to guard his lips, where he's going to guard his tongue, where he's going to keep himself from speaking evil, that this is something different that he's talking about. Part of what we're going to be looking at here, as you get down to verse 8, is there some type of a transgression that David has committed. There are some kind of problems that are in his life that he's dealing with. Along with the sin and the transgression that we read of in verse 8, we also see that God is punishing him for those things. He mentions here in verse 11, when you discipline a man with rebukes for sin, you consume like a moth what is dear to him. He then begs God that he would not hold his peace at his tears. He also asks that here in verse 8 that God would deliver him from all of his transgressions. So with that understanding in mind, that David has sinned and he's suffering for suffering the consequences of that sin, that there's something else going on here at the beginning of it. He begins with, I'm going to guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth, the muzzle, so long as the wicked are in my presence. There is something that David is not wanting to say in front of the wicked that is going to give the wrong idea or the wrong impression or a negative view of God. And that's what appears to be the first few verses. So he's going to keep himself from speaking of what's happening to him while he's in the presence of wicked people, so that perhaps either his reputation may not be tainted, or they may not have the wrong understanding of what God is doing in David's life right now. But we see in verse 2 that this was to no avail. Him keeping his tongue from speaking about what's in his life did not bring about the purpose that he had hoped. Not only that, but in verse 2 he says that his distress grew worse, and my heart became hot within me. And as he mused, as he stayed silent, and as he thought about what was going on in his life, he says here in verse 3, the fire burned. Jeremiah speaks in similar terminology. Whenever Jeremiah is suffering at the hands of God's people, when they're not acting like God's people, he says, I purposed in my heart to not speak anymore about God. He made this resolution that he would no longer talk about God, and yet this fire burned within him. David uses similar phrasing here in verse 3, that this fire burned whenever he told himself he was going to stay silent, and then he spoke with his tongue. So David had resolved, verses 1 through 3, to not talk about the suffering that he was going through at the hands of God for the sins that he had committed. But especially in verse 2 and verse 3, he mentions that this did not bring about the purpose that he had hoped for, and things just continued to go wrong, to get worse. And so in verses 4 down through verse 6, he first extols the greatness of God, and he helps to put a perspective on mankind. And he asks in verse 4, O Lord, make me know my end, and what is the measure of my days? Let me know how fleeting I am. I'm not particularly sure if David is really intending here that God would tell him exactly when he would die, or how long he would live, or the measure or the means of his death. I think he is speaking here in this broad sense of, let me understand that I am but fleeting. The same concept as we see maybe over in Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus tells us that we are but the dew or the flower that blossoms today is alive and thrown into the oven the next day. That, I think, is what David is asking us here, or asking God here, is to give him this proper perspective that his life is short compared to all of God's existence. To understand what we are going through, to understand the purposes of God, that God is going to allow us to suffer sometimes for the sins that we are in, that he disciplines every son whom he has, and he chastises everyone whom he receives. To understand that necessarily goes along with an understanding of eternity. Understanding that our life is but a small time period here on this earth. And whatever we are allowed to suffer through, whatever consequences we have here, in order for us to repent and return, that changes whenever we understand that our existence with God after this life, or our existence in punishment after this life, is so much greater. And so David begins with that. Lord, make me know my end and what is the measure of my days. Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you had made my days a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. He was making the point here that if you take his days, the days of his life, even though it has this great impact on us and on the rest of the world, David's life, even long for his time period, long for our time period, is still extremely short in the grand scheme of things. And then if you put all of mankind's life together, even if you were to string them end to end rather than overlapping like they are, he says all of that accounts to nothing before God. One of the hard things that Lydia has questioned about and Levi has questioned about, and I think every person has who is told about God's existence being from everlasting to everlasting, is to understand what that means. We are people who are born into time. We live our entire existence in time. And then in our own time, we die. And then time continues on without us. To understand what it would be like to be God who exists outside of time is, I think, impossible for us in this life. It was one of the things we need to take by faith. But that's what David's wrestling with here, is to understand that God has been before and that he will continue on after, and that all of mankind is but nothing before him. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. In verse 6, surely man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing they are in turmoil. Not only here in verse 4, 5, and 6 is mankind nothing, but the things that we worry about, the things that we struggle with, the things that we strive over and argue, all of that is nothing. And he gives the analogy here, the things that we heap up, the things that we mound together, the things we fight over, all of that is nothing. Solomon wrestles with this in Ecclesiastes, that a man acquires all of this and then he dies, and who takes over his possessions after him? It's vanity, as he says in chapter 3. And David is wrestling with that here too in chapter 6. We fight, we make wars over land, over money, over resources in this world, and then in the end, what does that matter? What does it profit me if I die in 40 years? Or if I die in the midst of the battle, what does it profit me? Even if my children or my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren, if they benefit some way financially from the things that I do, if they only benefit in this lifetime, what benefit is that? And so David says here in verse 6, surely for nothing they are in turmoil. The things that we worry about, the things that we strive for, the things that we fight over, David describes them as nothing. Surely for nothing they are in turmoil. And then he kind of gets to the heart of the matter here in verse 7. The perspective is in verse 4, 5, and 6. In the heart of the matter, the thing that he was trying to restrain his lips from speaking in front of evildoers, this is what he now has to pour forth. And now, O Lord, what do I wait? Or for what do I wait? My hope is in you. Deliver me from all my transgressions Do not make me the scorn of the fool. I am mute. I do not open my mouth, for it is you who have done it. There is a certain amount of questioning that sometimes we go through as we deal with the hardships and the trials of this life. And David is wrestling with that. We see that the first couple of verses that he said, I will set my guard on my mouth with a muzzle. I will be mute and silent. I will hold my peace. He then repeats some of those ideas here in verse 9. I am mute. I do not open my mouth. And he understands that it is God who has done it. But he then begs in verse 9, remove your stroke from me. I am silent, or I am spent by the hostility of your hand. When you discipline a man for rebukes for sin, you consume like a moth what is dear to him. Surely all mankind is a mere breath. He is wrestling with these things here in his life, and he had made the point to not speak of them. But then he made the wise choice to speak of them. And I love how in Psalm 39 he balances both a request for perspective in verses 4 through 6, then with a statement of he's waiting for God and a begging for his deliverance from his sins and his transgressions, while also making point that it is God who has done it, and that we are still but a mere breath before God. And so that he begs in verse 12 and verse 13, hear my prayer, O Lord, give ear to my cry, hold not your peace at my tears, for I am a sojourner with you, a guest like all my fathers. Sojourner is the same concept that we're looking at earlier, that our life is but a mere span, that it is a short time period, that is only a breath, that we are here today and tomorrow we're gone. And as Solomon says, that there's no lasting remembrance. Even someone as great as Solomon or his father David, how much do we really know about them still? We have some accounts of them throughout Kings and Chronicles. We have some of their words here in Psalms and in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. But how much do you know of Solomon? That we are here for a time and then we're gone, and then eventually anybody who would remember us, anybody who would really care to remember us that much, is long gone. And so David describes himself as a sojourner, as well as all of his fathers, that while here on this earth, we are just passing through while God is the constant in this life. And then verse 13, he has this interesting statement where he says, look away from me that I may smile again before I depart and I am no more. It appears, the first time maybe you read through that, it appears that he's begging that God just turn away from him. Kind of the same thing that David later laments, or earlier laments in Psalm 22, that he wishes that God wouldn't do. But this isn't looking away from me as in don't pay attention to me. This is the idea that comes up in Job chapter 7 and verse 19 and chapter 14 and verse 6. It's the idea that turn your angry gaze away from me, or look not on me in anger. I think that's the same thing that he's speaking of here, where he's just asking God to remove his anger and his punishment from him. And so Psalm 39 is just a beautiful psalm, and it deals with something that is really important to us. Whenever we go through hardships and trials as people who desire to be God's people and desire to be close to him, is it damaging to God if we speak of the things that we are going through before people who are outsiders or not? David begins with the idea that it is. He makes the point there in verse 2 that the end of verse 1, as long as the wicked are in my presence, I will keep my mouth shut. But by verse 2, he has a different understanding of this. He says, I was mute and I was silent, I held my peace, but to no avail, and my distress grew worse, and my heart became hot within me. And as I mused, the fire burned. And then he mentions that he then spoke. We see this through the minor prophets. I know that we are going through that not over at, it's here still at the table and with the Happy Hill. That as you go through the prophets, God doesn't just speak to the Israelites. He doesn't just speak to the Jews. He speaks to the nations around them as well. The message that is sent through the prophets to God's people is also to be proclaimed among the nations around them. That God proclaims that this destruction is for punishment for their sins, to draw the people back from the edge. And that is so that all people know that He is God. At the same time, when God brings about salvation and deliverance, whenever He restores the fortunes of His people, that also is to let people know that He is God, and that He is faithful to His covenant, and that His promises is something that He has made from ages ago, and He will continue to remain faithful to them. He also tells them, the prophets, that as He brings destructions on the nations around them for their sins, that is also so that they may know that He is God. And that question comes up here in Psalm 39. If we who are God's people suffer for the sins that we have committed by the hands of God, is that something that we have to keep silent about before others? David thought that it did. And then he tells us that it did not have any, he did it to no avail. And that the fire burned within him, and then he spoke. He asked for perspective. And as we deal with sufferings in our life, gaining perspective and asking for perspective should be at the top of our list. And before David asks or wrestles with why this is happening, he first asks for the perspective to understand why this is happening. He then wrestles with the things that he's going through, and he begs for salvation through all of this, asking that God save him from his transgressions, that He may not make him a scorn to the fools, that He remove his stroke from him, and that He would turn away His anger from him. All of these are extremely important points that are all laid out in Psalm 39. I know that it can be a confusing psalm the first couple times that you go through it, and I don't claim at all to be an expert in really any of these psalms. I just want to open you guys up to some of them so that you can begin to work through them on your own time as well. Turn me to Psalm 8. Psalm 8. This will be the next one we look at. This is the one I think is probably the best known by us. It's going to be partly a psalm, partly prophecy, and partly a scientific discovery. We'll talk about all of that here in a moment. Psalm 8 there in verse 1. To the choir master according to the Gittith, a psalm of David. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babes and infants you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? And yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of heaven and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. We probably know this because this is quoted over in Hebrews chapter 2, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But David here is writing this song, that the Lord is majestic and his name is in all the earth. I find that to be a beautiful sentiment. Paul speaks of this over in Romans chapter 1, that the things that that God should be clearly seen ever since the creation of the world and things that have been made. Hopefully on Sunday we'll get to talk about this a bit more, that God's fingerprints are on all of his creation. And so David extols that. How majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens, and out of the mouth of babes and infants you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger. And then in verse 3, when I look at your heavens and the works of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place. We looked in Psalm 39 where David talks about the vastness of time. And then the greater vastness of the existence that happens outside of time. And here in Psalm 8, instead of time, he is looking at the vastness of God's creation. What is amazing about this is that David writes this with almost no understanding about the larger universe around him. He sees the stars, he sees the heaven around him, but he does not understand, I don't believe at least, in the same sense that we do, of the vast distances or the amount of stars and planets that God has created in the universe. I mean, you don't have the telescope invented thousands and more years by this point in time, even the most crude one. And then still, we are still struggling to look and to see the things that are around us even to this day. And I don't believe we ever will get to understand and see everything. But his point is, whenever he looks at just the vastness of this world, a large portion of the world was not even discovered by David's time period, and certainly wasn't known by David. But you don't have to spend too much time outside to start to feel small. You hop into an ocean for a few minutes and understand that you could be swallowed up and carried off and no one would ever even see or be able to know or help. Climb a mountain and understand that you are but a speck on top of a speck that is one mountain inside of an entire mountain range. Size is something that is a really humbling thing. And so David says, when I look at the heavens and the works of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? What is it that makes us special? And the answer probably is not a whole lot. Of all the things that God has created, that he could have cared for, that he could have made into something, he chose us. And our importance in this creation is not based upon us being inherently great, but the care that God has put into us, the mindfulness that God has bestowed upon us. And so he marvels at that in verse 5, that yet you have made him a little lower than heavenly beings or the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor, and you have given him dominion over the works of your hands, and put all things under his feet. And then he includes in verse 7, the sheep and the oxen, the beasts of the fields, the birds of the heaven, the fish of the sea, that all those things that God has put under our command. I want us to understand that Hebrews chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, quote this section of Psalm 8. I fully believe that David sat down writing this as just an inspiration, that he was inspired to write about his existence. And God also used this as a prediction for his son. The whole point that the Hebrew writer is making over in Hebrews chapter 2 is that Jesus is greater than the angels. I keep on saying Hebrews chapter 2. My mind is fixating on Hebrews chapter 1. I just want to double check on that real quick. I apologize. Yep, Hebrews chapter 2. Is that Jesus is greater than even the angels. That for a time period while on earth, while as a man, he took on the form of a man and became a little lower than heavenly beings. But God, in his own time, crowned him with glory and honor, and then he gave him dominion over all the works of your hand. In the same way that we see on the sea, when the sea was riled up, and the apostles were afraid that they were all going to die, and they asked Jesus, why do you sleep when we're all going to perish? And he rebukes the wind and the waves. And from that, they marvel and say, well, who is this Even the wind and the waves obey his voice. And while here in verse 7 and verse 8, he specifically speaks of the animals, the oxen, the sheep, and the birds, and the fish, verse 6 is a bit more broad, that he has given him dominion over all the works of his hand, and Jesus shows that to just the fullest. And then also here in verse 8, there's this little extra piece. He says, the birds of the heaven, the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. About a year and a half ago, we had talked about this briefly in one of our other lessons, not really pertaining directly to Psalms, just one of the things that we find in the Bible. There was a man, Matthew Fontaine Murray, who was a seagoing man. He was a captain of a ship, and he was an avid reader of his Bible. And when he got to here into verse 8, he read that whatever passes along the paths of the sea. And he had spent his whole life sailing the sea, and these paths hadn't been discovered. And so he began to search for them. So Matthew Murray is actually ended up finding them. He wrote up a bunch of nautical coordinates. He put in a date. He then wrote a note saying that, if you find this bottle, please return it to me at this location. Drop the bottle off. Let me know when you found it. Dropped it in the sea all along the Atlantic Ocean, and then waited for everything to come back. And as the information started arriving back, he compiled it, and he found the path of the sea. Here in Richmond, over on Monument Avenue, there is actually a monument given over to Matthew Murray, who found the paths of the sea, and he has an inscription on the monument that quotes here Psalm 8 and in verse 8 for that. Now, Israel, if you take your time and you read through the Old Testament, you probably won't notice it until you start looking for it, that Israel was not a seafaring people. They didn't do very much at all with the sea. They were farmers. They were shepherds. They were traders. As far as I read, you don't read of large boats or seagoing vessels. David did not have deep knowledge of the sea. What he had was inspiration. Words that were written down here during David's time that weren't fully discovered or really understood or even consulted with up until the mid-1800s, well over 3,000 years after David penned them, that someone understood that God inspired David to write this phrase, the paths of the sea, and then found them. And so something you see here in poetry, just kind of moving on into verse 9, sometimes, and this happens both in ancient Hebrew poetry and sometimes in English poetry, that you will bookend poetry with the same phrase at the beginning and at the end. And it happens here in verse 9. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. There is so much that is going on here in Psalm 8. You have, like I said, this is a song that David writes. He sets it to whatever this musical term is there in the heading, that he writes it in a poetic language. He extols God for God caring about us out of all the things in his creation. Not only that, but you also have God layering in here prophecy of his son and how his son was going to be conducting himself on earth and the greatness that is bestowed upon him, and a little hidden gem in verse 8 of this secret knowledge of our world that God stuck in there and then just waited for 3,000 years for someone to figure it out. Psalm 8 is a beautiful psalm. I know this is probably one that's probably pretty well known, but I just wanted to spend a few minutes with you tonight going over it. I would like to go over Psalm 61, which is just one of my favorites, or has been one of my favorites in times past. Psalms is one of those books that sometimes we overlook during joyous times, and we shouldn't. Psalms of praise are actually the most numerous of all the psalms, but we often turn to psalms whenever things are hard or difficult. Psalms of lament are the second largest groupings of psalms in the book. There's also songs of deliverance, which is probably about the third most. But this is one that I have turned to over the years. It's a short one, just only Psalm 61 is only 8 verses. I just want to read that together with you. To the choir, master with stringed instruments of David. Hear my cry, O God, listen to my prayer. From the end of the earth I call to you when my heart is faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I, for you have been my refuge, a strong tower against the enemy. Let me dwell in your tent forever. Let me take refuge under the shelter of your wings. For you, O God, have heard my vows. You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name. Prolong the life of the king. May his years endure to all generations. May he be enthroned before God. Appoint steadfast love and faithfulness to watch over him. So I will ever sing praises to your name as I perform my vows day after day. This one is short, simple, and to the point, but there's a couple of key points I would like us to consider. This is David. I feel like maybe I state that too much when we read through passages like this, but that helps me at least to get some perspective of what I'm reading. David is the man. I mean, he's the king. He's the king over the entire nation of Israel. Well, not just over any nation, but it's God's nation. And David writes here in these next few verses, especially the second part of verse 2, and the next few ones down, verse 3 and verse 4, he speaks of the greatness of God. And when we think of David, we think of someone who's great, someone who's mightily powerful, who is extremely strong, skilled in battle, that he is, he's got the city of David, he lives in Jerusalem, one of the greatest cities at the time. And yet what he asks for in verse 2 is, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. Inside this psalm of salvation comes elements, if not a complete overtone of humility. To truly appreciate God's salvation, we need to understand our position. And David says, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. For you have been my refuge and a strong tower against the enemy. David has been well accomplished in battle. He has armies at his command. Horses and chariots larger than he should have. He has weaponry. He has protection. He has battlements. He has all kinds of things at his protection. And what he needs to understand, and what he does in this verse, is he understands that through all of those things, or with all of those things, or without all of those things, God is his refuge. We need to have the same perspective. Both the perspective in verse 2, that God is always the rock that is higher than us, and in verse 3, that he is our refuge, that he is our strong tower against the enemy. That is not inherently within us, is not in all the things that we possess or that are at our command, but only in God. He then continues into verse 4, let me dwell in your tent forever. David, who has the city of David, who lives in a palace, what he asks for is to dwell in God's tent. Huge, I think. Hard to understate. Let me refuge under the shelter of your wings, for you, O God, have heard my vows. You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name. Understanding the position that God has placed him in. Not the one that he has achieved on his own. And that is kind of shown the fact that it wasn't, whenever God appointed him as king, he was a shepherd that even his father had overlooked. That there wasn't anything kind of inherently about him as a warrior or as a man that says that I just deserve or demand to be king. This is somebody that God has handpicked out of the most unlikely of places. For you had given me the heritage of those who fear your name. And so he asks in verse 6, prolong the life of the king, make his years endure to all generations. Maybe he be enthroned forever before God. Appoint steadfast love and faithfulness to watch over him. And in verse 8, so I will ever sing praises to your name as I perform my vows day after day. That along with the salvation and the stronghold that God is, comes something very important here in verse 8. Us to continue to sing God's praises and to continue to perform our vows day after day. If we want God to be to be our rock and our refuge and our strong tower, if we want to dwell in his tent, if we want to take refuge under the shelter of his wings, then we also have to sing his praises. We also have to perform our vows day after day. Those two things go hand in hand. And for just the last couple minutes that we have tonight, a couple pages over into Psalm 66. Psalm 66. I know that we're kind of running a bit long, and I appreciate you sticking with me. Psalm 66, starting there in verse 1. To the choir master, a psalm. Shout for joy to God, all the earth. Sing the glory of his name. Give to him glorious praise. Say to God, how awesome are your deeds. So great is your power that your enemies come cringing before you. All the earth worships you and sing praises to you. They sing praises to your name. Come and see what God has done. He is awesome in his deeds towards the children of men. He turns the sea into dry land. They pass the river on foot. Then did we rejoice in him who rules by his might forever, whose eyes keep watch on the nations. Let not the rebellious exalt themselves. Bless our God, O peoples. Let the sound of his praise be heard, who has kept his soul, our souls, among the living, and has not let our feet slip. For you, O God, have tested us. You have tried us as silver is tried. You brought us into the net. You laid a crushing burden on our backs. You let men ride over our heads. We went through fire and through water, yet you have brought us to a place of abundance. I will come into your house with burnt offerings. I will perform my vows to you, that which my lips utter and my mouth promised when I was in trouble. I will offer to you burnt offerings of fatted animals, with the smoke of the sacrifice of rams. I will make an offering of bulls and goats. Come and hear, all you who fear God, and I will tell you what he has done for my soul. I cried to him with my mouth, and high praise was on my tongue. If I have cherished iniquity in my heart, the Lord would not have listened, but truly God has listened. He has attended to the voice of my prayer. Blessed be God, because he has not rejected my prayer, or removed his steadfast love from me. Again, there is just so much we can talk about, but I want to just highlight for the last couple minutes just a few key sentiments here. He begins as a standard psalm of praise. He says, shout for joy to God, all the earth, sing the glory of his name, give him the glorious praise. Say to God, how awesome are your deeds, so great is your power that your enemies come cringing before you. And then he says in verse 5 to his audience, come and see what God has done. And then he recounts, or at least he alludes to some of the things that happened during the time period of the wandering and into the conquest. He talks about that they had crossed over the sea and dry land. They passed through the river on foot. Whether you see that as two different things, either the sea that they crossed out of Egypt and then the river that they crossed to get into the land, or as both things in one, however you want to look at them, God has done it. It says in verse 6, and they did rejoice in him, who rules with might forever, who keeps his watch on the nations, and let not the rebellious exalt over him. He speaks later on of some of the other things that happened, and then he says that you have brought us into a land of abundance in verse 12. But there's a couple key things I want us to consider. Whenever we are thankful to God, what we see kind of consistently throughout the Psalms is not only are people thankful to God for what he has done and tell him so, but also we see that there is this, I'm thankful to you, O God, and then I'm going to go and I'm going to tell other people about it. And that's what the psalmist is doing here in Psalm 66, where he invites other people to come and to see what God has done. And then again in verse 8, bless our God, O peoples. Let the sound of his praise be heard, who has kept our souls among the living and has not let our feet slip. But also, one of the key things of Psalm 66 is starting there in verse 10. That you, O God, have tested us. You have tried us like silver is tried. That you have brought us into the net, and you have laid crushing burdens on our backs, and you let men ride over our heads. We went through fire and through water. Are those things that we oftentimes want to talk to people about? Do we often come see what God has done in my life? Look at all these trials I've gone through. Look at all the hardships I endured. This is just a wonderful thing. And yet that is exactly what the psalmist is doing here in Psalm 66. He is ecstatic that God has allowed them to go through all of this and then brought them through and then blessed them abundantly. And his answer to all that is not only telling people about it, but what happens here in verse 13. I will come to your house with burnt offerings. I will perform my vows to you. The same thing we look back in Psalm 61. That which my lip utters and my mouth promised when I was in trouble, I will offer to your burnt offerings of fatted animals. There's an old saying that there is no atheist in a foxhole. And unfortunately, the same thing seems to go in times of hardships and in places of hardships. If you find someone who is struggling for their life and they are a non-Christian or a fallen away Christian, oftentimes large vows of what's going to happen if they get better, absolute commitments of I'm going to be this way once I recover and once I get out of the hospital, once I'm home and back in my regular routine, everything's going to change in my life, only for them to not change at all. As soon as the trials pass, so does all those promises. But the psalmist makes the opposite point. He says, that which my lips uttered and my mouth promised when I was in trouble, I will do those things. I will offer to you burnt offerings of fatted animals, with smoke of the sacrifice of rams. I will make an offering of bulls and goats. And then he invites again people to come and to hear. Verse 16, come and hear, all you who fear God, and I will tell you what he has done for my soul. Sometimes we only focus on the positive things that God has done for our soul. Sometimes we only look at the things that we really like that God has done. And what the psalmist picks up on and he extols God for is not only the abundant land that they were brought into, not only is it that God has done these great things, but that God has done great things to refine his people and to bring them through, including being caught up in the net and tested like silver, and men riding over their heads and having these crushing burdens laid on their back. And this is included in the things here in verse 16, where the psalmist says, come and hear, all you who fear God, and I will tell you of what he has done for my soul. I cried to him with my mouth, and high praise was on my tongue. If I have cherished iniquity in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. One of the key things that is a key to understanding why this person has gone through hardship and has excelled through it is this fact that he did not cherish iniquity. For, in verse 18, the Lord would not have listened if he had, but truly the God had listened, and he had attended to the voice of my prayer. It's an amazing thing to think of when we look at Psalm 8. What is man? When we look at the heavens and the stars and the moon, all the things that God has created, what is man that he's mindful? And yet, here in verse 19, the psalmist makes the point that God is attentive to the voice of our prayers. That we can bend the ear of the Almighty for a moment while we pray to him. And so he says, blessed be God, because he has not rejected my prayer or removed his steadfast love from me. John writes, where he mentions here that if we are faithful, God will be faithful in return. There in 1 John chapter 2. He also makes the point that if we are unfaithful, God remains faithful. And that's what we see here in Psalm 66, that the psalmist is extolling God for. Blessed be God, because he did not remove his steadfast love from me. Part of this word steadfast love is a beautiful word in Hebrew. It's a word that speaks of his covenant love. Psalm 66 is another beautiful one that ties in historical references, deals with how we are to handle hardships, the hearts that we are to have through them, and then what do we do afterwards? Do we stay silent? Do we just stow that away in our own hearts? Well, the answer is no, because in Psalm 66, he invites everybody to come and hear. And he has special things that he wants to say to those who fear God. How many things could we talk about that God has laid on our backs, or he has let other people run over our heads? How oftentimes could we invite people to come and to hear what God has done for our souls by catching us in a net and allowing us to go through hardships? And can we honestly, in our hearts, talk about the greatness of God through all of that? Because that's what the psalmist does. I think is a really neat thing, and something that I hope that I'm able to do more of in the future, more effectively. Thank you guys so much for studying with us. I know we looked through just 4 Psalms. I don't know how long we'll get to do this in this format before we get to go back to our old format, but I hope it's sometime soon that we get to go back to our old format. If not, then we will continue on with our study of Psalms. We'll pick out maybe 3 or 4 for next week, and we'll continue on. Thank you guys so much for studying with me tonight. I hope you have a wonderful week.